I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, so when I saw an ad on Craigslist offering a vintage doll that was supposedly haunted, I jumped at the chance to buy it. The seller claimed that the doll had been passed down through generations of her family, and that it had a history of moving on its own, whispering at night, and causing unexplained accidents. I met the seller in a public place, and she handed over the doll in a plain brown paper bag. I felt a strange thrill of excitement as I carried it home. When I got home, I set the doll on a shelf in my living room and watched it for a while, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with apprehension as I looked at the vintage doll that I had just purchased. It was a beautiful doll, with long curly hair and a delicate lace dress. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The seller had warned me about the doll's history, but I didn't really believe in the paranormal. I thought it was all just a bunch of made-up stories meant to scare people. But as the days passed, strange things started to happen that made me question my beliefs. The first thing I noticed was that the doll seemed to be moving on its own. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I would come home from work and find the doll in a different position than I had left it. Once, I even found it lying face down on the floor, as if it had been thrown. I tried to explain it away, telling myself that maybe I had just forgotten where I had put the doll. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something else going on. As the days went by, things only got stranger. I started hearing whispers at night, as if someone was speaking right next to my ear. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I started hearing the whispers even when I was wide awake. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. There was something else in the room with me. Then, things started getting dangerous. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find objects thrown across the room. Once, a vase shattered right next to my head, narrowly missing me. I tried to get rid of the doll, but every time I tried to throw it away, I would find it back on my shelf the next day. It was as if the doll didn't want to leave me. One night, I woke up to find the doll sitting on my chest, its lifeless eyes staring into mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear. That's when I knew that I had to do something. I contacted a paranormal investigator, hoping that they could help me get rid of the doll once and for all. The investigator arrived a few days later and immediately went to work. He set up cameras and audio equipment throughout the house, hoping to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. As the days went by, the investigator started to piece together the history of the doll. He discovered that it had been possessed by a vengeful spirit, who had been wronged by the doll's previous owners. The spirit had been trapped inside the doll for years, waiting for someone to set it free. And when I had bought the doll, I had unwittingly released the spirit into my home. The investigator worked tirelessly to perform a ritual that would banish the spirit back to where it came from. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doll went still. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The investigator packed up his equipment and left, leaving me alone with the still and lifeless doll. But even though the spirit was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there with me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that the doll still held a power over me. In the end, I decided to get rid of the doll for good. I took it out into the woods and buried it deep in the ground, hoping that it would never be found again. But even now, years later, I still think about the doll and the vengeful spirit that once possessed it. I was so excited when I landed the job of my dreams in Austin. I had been searching for a while and finally, I found something that seemed perfect. The only problem was that I didn't know anyone in the city, and I had to find a place to stay. I decided to turn to Craigslist, hoping to find something affordable and in a great location. That's when I stumbled upon an ad for a shared apartment that seemed like a perfect fit. The rent was affordable, the location was great, and the current roommate, named Sarah, seemed friendly in our email correspondence. I emailed Sarah right away and set up a time to meet her and check out the apartment. When I arrived, I was pleased with what I saw. The apartment was in a great location and seemed well maintained. Sarah was friendly and welcoming, and we hit it off right away. We signed the lease, and I moved in a few days later. At first, everything seemed great. Sarah was welcoming and showed me around the apartment. She even offered to help me unpack and settle in. I thought I had lucked out and found the perfect roommate. However, within a few days, things started to go downhill. Sarah was messy, loud, and had no boundaries. She would leave her dishes in the sink for days, and the apartment smelled like stale food. She would play music late into the night and talk loudly on the phone, making it impossible for me to get a good night's sleep. I tried to talk to Sarah about these issues, but she always brushed me off. She would say things like, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll clean up later." Or, "I'm just blowing off steam. It's not a big deal." I tried to be understanding at first, but as time went on, I found myself growing more and more frustrated. The real breaking point came when Sarah started to invade my privacy. She would walk into my room without knocking, borrow my things without asking, and invite her friends over for parties every weekend. It was clear that she had no respect for me or my space. I tried to talk to her about this, but she just laughed it off. She would say things like, "Oh, come on. We're roommates. We should be able to share things." Or, "Relax, it's just a party. You're welcome to join us if you want." I felt like I was going crazy. Things got even worse when Sarah started to bring home guys she had met online. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of them having sex in the next room. It was beyond awkward and uncomfortable, and I felt like I had nowhere to go. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. I had signed a year-long lease, and I couldn't afford to break it. I also didn't have any friends or family in the city that I could turn to. I felt trapped and alone. One day, I decided to confront Sarah once and for all. I told her that her behavior was unacceptable and that I couldn't continue to live like this. She just laughed and told me to lighten up. That was the last straw. I started to look for another place to stay, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. I didn't have much money, and I couldn't afford to pay for 2 places at once. I started to feel like I was stuck in this terrible living situation with no way out. Finally, after months of searching, I found a small studio apartment that I could afford. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was a place where I could finally have some peace and quiet. I moved out of the shared apartment and into my new studio as soon as I could. It was a relief to finally be out of that toxic environment and have a space that I could call my own. However, the experience had taken a toll on me, both emotionally and financially. I had to spend a lot of money on the deposit and first month's rent for my new apartment, and I had to buy all new furniture since I had been living in a furnished apartment with Sarah. I also felt like I had lost a lot of my trust in people, especially when it came to finding a roommate. Looking back on my experience, I realized that I had made a mistake by not thoroughly vetting Sarah before moving in with her. I had been so desperate for a place to stay that I had overlooked some warning signs that she might not be the best roommate. I also realized that I should have spoken up sooner when I started to notice issues with her behavior. Instead of trying to be understanding, I should have set clear boundaries and expectations from the beginning. Moving forward, I knew that I needed to be more careful when it came to finding a place to live. I made a list of questions to ask potential roommates, and started to research different neighborhoods to find the best fit for me. Overall, my experience with Sarah was a nightmare, but it taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of finding a good living situation. I was grateful to have found my own space and to be able to move on from that difficult time in my life. I've always been a bit of a true crime buff, so when I saw an ad on Craigslist offering a tour of the city's most notorious murder sites, I was intrigued. The ad promised a knowledgeable guide who would take us to the scenes of some of the city's most infamous crimes and share details and insights that weren't available in the media. I showed up at the designated meeting spot and was relieved to see a friendly-looking guy holding a sign with the tour company's name. We chatted a bit before he led me and a small group of other tourists to a van parked nearby. We climbed in and buckled up, excited for the tour to begin. As we drove through the city, our guide began regaling us with stories of gruesome murders and unsolved mysteries. I was fascinated, hanging on his every word as he described the brutal acts that had taken place at each location we visited. The first stop was an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Our guide told us that a notorious serial killer had used the building as a dumping ground for his victims, and that the police had never been able to catch him. As we explored the creepy, dilapidated structure, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After leaving the warehouse, we made our way to a quiet suburban street where a family had been brutally murdered in their own home. The guide pointed out the house, now a vacant shell of its former self, and described in detail the horrifying acts that had taken place inside. I felt a chill run down my spine as I imagined the terror that the family must have felt in their final moments. As we drove to the next location, I noticed that the guide seemed to be getting increasingly agitated. He kept checking his phone and muttering to himself under his breath. I wondered if something was wrong, but I didn't want to ask and risk ruining the tour. We arrived at a desolate park on the outskirts of the city, where a young woman had been brutally murdered just a few years earlier. The guide led us to the spot where her body had been found, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness and horror at the thought of what had happened to her. As we started to make our way back to the van, I noticed that the guide was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, but he was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the guide emerge from the underbrush, a wild look in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have something to show you." I hesitated for a moment, but the curiosity got the better of me. I followed the guide as he led me deeper into the park, away from the rest of the group. As we walked, he began to tell me a story that chilled me to the bone. He told me that he was actually the brother of one of the most infamous serial killers in the city's history. He said that he had been obsessed with his brother's crimes since he was a child, and had spent years researching and studying them. He claimed that he knew things about the murders that no one else did, and that he could help me understand the mind of a killer. As we reached a clearing in the woods, I realized that something was seriously wrong. The guide was no longer speaking in a calm, measured tone. He was practically shouting, his eyes wild with excitement. I tried to back away, but he grabbed my arm and pulled me towards him. "You want to know what it feels like to kill, don't you?" he hissed. "I can show you. I can make you understand." I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. He pinned me against a tree, his hands closing around my neck. I struggled and fought, but it was no use. He was too powerful. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard a voice behind me. It was one of the other tourists from the tour, a burly, muscular man who had followed us into the woods. He tackled the guide to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. I was shaken and traumatized by the experience, but I knew that it could have been much worse. I thanked the man who had saved my life, and as I sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and sipping on a warm cup of tea, I couldn't believe what had just happened. The friendly guide who had seemed so knowledgeable and enthusiastic had turned out to be a deranged killer, just like his brother. The police arrived quickly and took the guide into custody. They asked me to give a statement, and I did my best to recount what had happened, but my memory was foggy and disjointed. All I could think about was how close I had come to being his next victim. As the shock and adrenaline wore off, I began to feel the weight of what had happened. I couldn't believe that I had put myself in such a dangerous situation, all because of my obsession with true crime. I felt foolish and naive, and wondered how I could have been so blind to the danger. The other tourists who had been on the tour were equally shaken. We sat in silence in the back of the police car as they drove us back to the city, each lost in our own thoughts and fears. When we arrived at the station, the police took our names and phone numbers, and told us that they would contact us if they needed any further information. They also offered us counseling services and urged us to seek help if we were struggling to cope with what had happened. I took their advice and met with a therapist a few days later. Talking through my experience helped me to process my emotions and begin to heal. I also took a break from true crime for a while, realizing that my fascination with violence and horror had led me down a dangerous path. Over time, I began to feel more like myself again. I started going out with friends, taking walks in the park, and doing other activities that brought me joy. I also took a self-defense class, determined to never be caught off guard like that again. Looking back on that fateful day, I realized that it could have turned out so much worse. I am grateful to the man who intervened and saved my life, and to the police who responded quickly and professionally. But most of all, I am grateful to be alive, and to have learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of obsession and curiosity.